Hello, I'm Susan Howard, and my presentation is on trauma-informed mental health care for homeless women and children fleeing domestic violence. Some of the considerations in this briefing include a definition and scope of the problem, some legislative policy and social work considerations, and a list of holistic recommendations at the end. The terminology used in this briefing is described here as reference. Portland, Oregon's homeless population has risen by 50% since 2019. Many of these people, 28% actually of these people, are women and children fleeing domestic violence situations. It is a leading cause of homelessness for women in Oregon. There is definitely a correlation between homelessness and domestic violence, and it is directly proportional. Domestic violence situations are directly proportional to the amount of homelessness experienced by women and children. Women and children need available, affordable shelter in order to escape their abusers. Access to emergency shelters and assistance with affordable permanent housing are critical to help these people escape the violent situations they find themselves in. Homelessness is definitely a women's issue. It's a domestic violence issue, it's a criminal justice issue, and women are impacted more significantly than men. Children are also significantly impacted by homelessness and domestic violence. The trauma-informed treatment for homeless women fleeing domestic violence needs to increase. The three pillars of trauma-informed care that need to be provided include safety, connections and staying connected with community, and emotional regulation, which is difficult for people fleeing domestic violence situations. Trauma-informed treatment also needs to include safe spaces and trauma-informed spaces, such as this space shown at the Rosehaven Shelter in Portland, Oregon. The intake process is critically important for homeless women and children and determines whether the family will stay in a recovery process or go back to their abuser. So it's important to have a trauma-informed intake process, which includes some of the things listed here. The trauma-informed intake process needs to incorporate a strengths-based assessment, meaning that it's important to identify the strengths, skills, ambitions, and long-term goals of people entering this system so that they can realize that the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any, which they actually do. The current state of services' most critical problem right now is lack of shelter capacity. Shelters are at capacity across the country, and this need has gotten significantly worse over the past few years. Implications for social work practitioners are overwhelming workloads and vicarious trauma, which must be balanced against mental health care for the practitioners themselves. The recent legislative and policy issues in the Oregon 2022 legislative session that passed include House Bill 5202, which has a $10 million set aside to increase services for Oregon domestic violence survivors, including increased capacity for shelters. Overall, the homeless crisis in Oregon received $400 million in a housing package in the 2022 legislative session. Trauma-informed mental health care for homeless domestic violence survivors in Portland should include trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is typically a short-term CBT process to help clients overcome the trauma and PTSD type trauma therapy like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization. An example of a trauma-informed care program in Portland, Oregon includes the Raphael House, which has incorporated trauma-informed philosophy into their day-to-day work and policies, including trauma education and training for all their staff and ongoing inclusion of participant voices. Short-term immediate recommendations include following through with the Oregon legislative bills that just passed to provide increased capacity in domestic shelters. Also, provide financial assistance for women and children recovering from a domestic violence situation to get back on their feet. Long-term systemic recommendations must use a holistic approach. That starts with education for young boys and girls on healthy relationships, empowering girls to become strong women, and increased provisions for job skill development for women so that they can provide for their own families without having to rely on their abuser. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.